The arrow took the orc woman in the shoulder, and still she did not fall. Elias Lawson heard the scream of it split the salt air before he saw her, a ragged cry of pain bitten off halfway, swallowed by pride. And when he crested the last switchback of the cliff trail with a half-finished blade still clutched in his tongs, he found her on her knees in the gorse, blood running black down her arm, 3 men closing in with drawn steel, and a 4th notching a second arrow to his bowstring. She was enormous, even kneeling, broad through the shoulder in a way no human woman ever was, her skin the deep mottled green of river stone, and even bleeding, even hunted. There was something in the tilt of her jaw that refused to beg. She wore fitted travel leathers, dark and salt-stained, laced tight up a torso corded with muscle, a leather bodice that had clearly been made for war rather than modesty, and a long knife at her hip that she had not yet drawn only because her hands were shaking too badly to trust it. "That's far enough," Elias said, and did not entirely believe he had said it until the words were already out of his mouth and hanging in the cold wind off the sea. The bowman laughed. "Smith, go back to your fire. This isn't your quarrel. You're on my land." Elias planted himself between the orc woman and the 4 men, the half-forged blade in his tongs still glowing faintly orange at the edge, more threat of habit than of use. His heart hammered so hard he thought they must hear it. He had never in his life stood between anyone and an arrow. "That makes it my quarrel." "There's a bounty on her head worth more than this whole rotten cliff," said the leader, a barrel-chested man named Voss with a scar bisecting one eyebrow. "Chief Gorlak Bloodfang wants his bride returned, and he pays in gold for the getting." "Step aside, Smith, and you can keep both your hands." Elias felt the orc woman go very still behind him, not the stillness of surrender, the stillness of an animal deciding whether it was worth dying to take one enemy down with her. "I'm not stepping aside," he said. Voss's eyes narrowed. "You don't even know what she is." "I know what you are," Elias said. 4 men and a bow against 1 wounded woman, I know that plain enough." The bowman loosed. Elias had never moved so fast in his life. He threw himself sideways, more instinct than courage, and the arrow that would have taken the orc woman through the throat instead grazed his forearm and buried itself in the turf. Pain lit up bright and sudden, blood welling along the furrow the shaft had carved, and somewhere behind him, the orc woman made a sound low in her chest that was not quite a growl and not quite a cry. "Elias." It was the first time she said his name, though she should not have known it, and he would wonder for weeks after where she had learned it, until she told him, much later, that Voss had spoken it while boasting to his men about the fool blacksmith who lived alone on the cliff and would be easy enough to threaten out of the way. She was on her feet before the second arrow could be drawn, moving with a speed that should have been impossible for someone her size, and she put herself bodily in front of him, taking the second shaft high in the meat of her own shoulder rather than let it find him. She roared then, a sound that rolled out over the cliffs and startled gulls from the rocks below, and the 4 hunters who had clearly expected an easy capture and not a woman willing to eat arrows for a stranger took an involuntary step back. "Enough!" Elias shouted, and there was iron in his voice now, forge iron, the voice he used when a client tried to cheat him on a commission. "You've drawn blood on my land twice. The next man who knocks an arrow answers to the wardens in Half Fairy, and I will swear to them exactly what I saw. It was a bluff. The wardens in Half Fairy, 2 days' ride, cared little for orc bounty hunts and less for one lonely smith's word. But Voss did not know that, and men who hunted for coin rather than honor rarely wished to spend their profit on trouble with the law. "This isn't finished," Voss said, spitting into the gorse. "She's worth too much. We'll be back, Smith, and next time you won't have surprise on your side." They withdrew down the switchback trail, cursing, and Elias stood with his heart slamming against his ribs until the last of them vanished around the rocky shoulder of the cliff. Only then did he turn and find the orc woman staring at him with an expression he could not read, something between fury and disbelief. "You are a fool," she said. Her voice was low, roughened, carrying the guttural music of orcish beneath the common tongue. "You do not know me. You do not know what I have done, what I am worth, what will come to your door because of this. You're worth an arrow through your shoulder for someone else's problem, Elias said, coming closer despite the blood soaking her sleeve. That's enough for me to know right now. Can you walk? She looked at him a long moment, chest heaving, blood dripping steadily from the second wound onto the pale gorse flowers, and something in her fierce yellow eyes flickered surprise, maybe, at being asked rather than commanded. I can walk, she said. I do not need help. She took 3 steps and her knees buckled, and Elias caught her before she hit the ground, staggering under a weight that nearly took them both down the slope toward the sea. Sure, he said, grunting with the effort of it. Not at all. She did not thank him. But she did not fight him either, as he half carried, half guided her the last quarter-mile up the winding cliff path toward the old gray shoulder of Cragalow Keep, its broken monastery spire silhouetted black against a sky gone the color of a healing bruise. Cragalow had not been a monastery in 80 years. The brothers who had once carved iron and silver from the tunnels beneath the cliff had died out or moved on, leaving behind a fortress of gray stone with a forge in what had been the chapter house, and a bell tower that no longer held a bell. Elias' father had bought the ruin for a song and turned the old scriptorium into a smithy, and Elias had inherited both the keep and the trade. Along with a solitude he had never quite decided whether he loved or merely endured. He lived alone at the edge of the world, forging blades for merchants and border garrisons who rode 2 days out of their way for his steel, and he had grown so used to the empty echo of his own footsteps in the long stone halls that he sometimes talked to the forge fire simply to hear a voice answer, even if it was only the crackle of flame. He laid the orc woman down on the wide oak table in the chapter house, pushed aside half-finished tang and pommel, and set about cutting away the leather at her shoulder with the same steady hands he used to true a blade. Hold still, he said. This is going to hurt. I have had worse, she said through gritted teeth, and did not so much as flinch as he worked the arrowhead free. What's your name? He asked, mostly to keep her talking, keep her from the shock that could take a wounded creature under. She was silent so long he thought she would not answer. Urzoth, she said finally. Urzoth Thunderroar. Elias Lawson, he said, though she already knew it. Well met, under better circumstances than these, I'd hope. Something that might almost have been a laugh, dry and pained, escaped her. You are either the bravest man I have met in 10 winters, Elias Lawson, or the greatest fool. My father always said there wasn't much difference, Elias said, and pressed a clean cloth hard against her wound, and did not let go until the bleeding slowed. She stayed 3 days at first, though neither of them called it staying, she called it healing. And healing, she informed him with the flat certainty of someone unused to being questioned, was not the same as trust. Elias gave her the old infirmary cell off the cloister, a narrow stone room with a single window looking out over the sea, and she prowled it the first night like something caged. Though the door had no lock and he had told her twice, she was free to leave whenever her legs would carry her. You do not understand, she told him on the second evening, when he brought her broth and bread and found her sitting cross-legged on the floor rather than the bed, sharpening her long knife with slow, deliberate strokes, though the wound in her shoulder still wept where the stitches pulled. I am not a guest, Smith. I am a debt walking on 2 legs. Wherever I go, trouble follows, and it will find your door soon enough whether you wish it or not. Then tell me what kind of trouble so I know what's coming, he said, setting the bowl down within her reach. She looked at him for a long moment, weighing something. There is a chieftain of the Bloodfang clan named Gorlak. 12 years past, my clan and his fought a war that bled us both near to nothing. There is peace now, of a kind, a bride-price peace. I was promised to him when I came of age, to bind the 2 clans in blood so the killing would stop. I refused it. I fled 2 seasons ago, and every bounty hunter and honor-bound tracker between here and the Ashfall Mountains has been paid to bring me back alive, so the marriage can still be made and the treaty held. And if it isn't made, then the peace breaks, she said simply, and men on both sides die who have already buried enough sons. That is what I carry with me, Smith. Not romance, not devotion. Duty, mine and my clan's both, and my refusal to pay it. You don't want him, Elias said. It was not a question, her lip curled. I have never met him, that is not the point. The point is that I would rather die free on some nameless cliff than live chained to a man I did not choose, no matter how many lives my choice costs. Is that so hard for a human to understand? No, Elias said quietly. I understand it fine. She studied him for a long moment, as if his answer had cost her some certainty she had been relying on, then returned to her knife without another word, and he left her to the sound of steel against stone, and to a silence between them that was, for the first time since the arrow, something less than hostile. 2 weeks became a season before either of them spoke of her leaving again. She healed faster than any human would have orc flesh knit thick and stubborn, Elias learned, and within 10 days she was walking the cliff paths at dawn to test her strength, and within 3 weeks she had wandered into his forge uninvited and stood watching him work with an intensity that made the back of his neck prickle. You are doing that wrong, she said one such morning, watching him hammer a fuller into a sword blank. Elias did not look up. This is my trade, Urzoth. I've done it 15 years. And my people have forged iron since before your grandfathers learned to walk upright, she said, and there was no cruelty in it, only that same flat certainty. You are striking too high on the bevel. You will weaken the spine. He straightened, sweat-slicked and irritated, and found her standing in the forge doorway with her arms crossed beneath the swell of her breasts, the morning light through the high window catching the green of her skin and turning it almost gold, her dark hair thick and coarse and bound back in a single warrior's braid, falling over one broad shoulder. She was, he realized with an unwelcome jolt somewhere beneath his ribs, breathtaking in a way that had nothing to do with softness and everything to do with strength. The kind of beauty that did not ask to be admired but simply was, the way a mountain simply was. Me then, he said, more challenge than invitation. She crossed to him, took the hammer from his hand, her fingers brushing his, calloused and warm, and he felt that brush travel up his arm like a spark jumping a gap and turned the blade in the tongs with an ease that told him this was no idle boast. Here, she said, striking true and clean, the ring of it different from his own blows, deeper, more certain. Orc smiths fold the steel 7 times, not 5. It is slower. It is also stronger. Your border town blades break in a hard winter because your smiths are impatient. My blades don't break, Elias said, stung despite himself. Not yet, she said, and there was the ghost of something wicked in the corner of her mouth. Give it time. He laughed before he could stop himself, and she looked up at the sound as if she had not expected it, as if she had forgotten, in 2 seasons of running, what it was to hear a man laugh easily and without threat behind it, and something passed between them in that moment, brief, unnamed, and entirely too warm for either of them to acknowledge. She began coming to the forge every morning after that. She taught him the 7-fold fold, and he taught her the trick of tempering in seawater rather than well water, which she grudgingly admitted gave a harder edge than her own people's methods. And between the hammer blows and the hiss of quenched steel, they talked about her clan's mountains far to the east, about his father who had died of a winter fever 3 years past and left him alone in this crumbling keep with only the sea for company, about the loneliness neither of them had ever named aloud to another living soul until it spilled, unbidden, into the space between anvil and forge. You live here alone, she said one evening, watching the sun bleed orange into the water from the high window of the old bell tower where they had taken to sitting after the day's work was done. No wife, no children underfoot, does it not gnaw at you? Every day, he admitted, surprising himself with the honesty of it. I used to think I'd get used to the quiet. I never have. I know that hunger, she said low. A war band is never quiet. There is always someone at your shoulder, someone to share meat with, to share watch with. And then you run, and it is only you and the wind and your own thoughts circling like carrion birds. She glanced sideways at him. This is the first quiet that has not felt like starving. Elias did not trust himself to answer that. He only reached over, slow enough that she could pull away if she wished, and covered her hand where it rested on the cold stone between them. She did not pull away. She looked down at his hand, smaller than hers, scarred from forge work, calloused in different places than her own, and turned hers over beneath it, palm to palm, and for a long moment neither of them breathed. "This is unwise," she said softly, though she did not move. "Probably," he agreed. "I am hunted, Smith. Whatever this is between us, it will bring danger to your door faster than any bounty hunter's arrow." "Then I'll meet it when it comes," Elias said. "I'd rather have this and the danger than nothing at all and be safe." Urzoth turned her hand fully into his grip then, lacing her thick green fingers through his human ones, and the two of them sat in silence as the sun went down over the water, and neither called it what it was, though both of them knew. The second hunting party came at the height of a storm, 3 weeks after that quiet evening in the bell tower, and this time there were 7 of them, led by Voss again, his scarred brow set in the look of a man who had spent his advance already, and needed the rest of the bounty to survive the winter. They came up the cliff road in the gray light before dawn, and Elias woke to Urzoth's hand shaking his shoulder, her voice a low, urgent growl. "Riders, 7, maybe 8. They mean to take the keep, not ask politely at the gate." He was up and dressed in moments. A sword he had forged with his own hands, the finest he had ever made. A gift he had given her without ceremony a week past, which she had accepted with a look he still did not fully understand, belted at her hip, and his own blade in his hand as they stood together in the old cloister yard, as the sun came up bloody over the sea. "Urzoth Thunderroar," Voss called from horseback, his men fanning out along the broken wall, bows already drawn. "The bounty's doubled since last we spoke. Gorlak grows impatient. You can come easy, or you can watch this keep burn around you and come anyway." "You will not touch this keep," Urzoth said, and her voice carried across the yard like a rolling clap of thunder, deep and terrible, and Elias felt the hair on his arms rise at the sound of it. "You will not touch this man. I have killed better hunters than you for smaller insults, Voss, and I have grown very tired of running from lesser men." "There's 8 of us and 2 of you," Voss said, though something in his posture had shifted, some old animal caution. "Then the numbers favor you," Elias said, stepping up beside her, his sword steady in his hand though his heart hammered fit to burst. "But I forged every blade in this yard myself, and I promise you, Voss, mine hold their edge. Ride away now and no one bleeds. Ride at us, and I promise you will not enjoy what my orc-folded steel does to men who are used to fighting the untrained." It was bravado mostly, but it worked upon men who had already once tasted an arrow's failure against this pair, and after a long, taut moment in which the only sound was the wind and the surf far below, Voss spat into the dirt and wheeled his horse. "This isn't over," he called back, already retreating. "Gorlak won't stop paying until she's dragged back in chains or dead in a ditch. Best you remember that, Smith, before you die for a woman who will leave you the moment her own people come calling." They rode off down the cliff road, and Urzoth stood rigid beside Elias until the hoofbeats faded entirely, and only then did she let out a long, shuddering breath. "He is not wrong," she said quietly. "My own people may yet come, and when they do, it will not be gold they offer but blood debt and clan honor, and those cannot be turned aside with a sharp blade and a brave word." "Let them come," Elias said, though his hands were not quite steady as he sheathed his sword. "I'm not handing you to anyone, Urzoth. Not for gold, not for duty, not for anything." She turned to look at him then, and there was something raw and unguarded in her yellow eyes that he had not seen before, something that looked almost like fear, though he suspected it had less to do with Voss and his bounty hunters than with the words Elias had just spoken and what they might mean for the careful walls she had built around her own heart. "You should be afraid of me," she said. "Everyone else is." "I've never been afraid of you," Elias said, and reached up slow, deliberate, giving her every chance to step back, and brushed a strand of dark hair from her face where the wind had torn it loose. Her skin beneath his fingers was warm, warmer than he expected, and she went very still beneath the touch, like a creature deciding whether to bolt or lean in. She leaned in. It was the first time either of them let the season of denial break, and the kiss, when it came, was nothing like Elias had imagined in the quiet nights he had lain awake listening to her breathing through the wall between their rooms. It was fierce and hungry and a little desperate, her hand fisting in the front of his shirt as if she meant to pull him bodily into her, and he answered with everything he had, months of careful distance burning away in an instant. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathing hard, she pressed her forehead to his, her thick braid falling forward to curtain them both from the gray morning light. "This changes nothing," she said, though her voice shook. "I am still hunted. I am still promised elsewhere by law I did not choose." "It changes everything," Elias murmured against her mouth, "and you know it." She did not argue further. She only kissed him again, slower this time, and let herself, for one long moment, simply be held. Cagran Ironjaw arrived 11 days later, alone, on foot, and unarmed, but for the long ceremonial spear of a clan enforcer strapped across his back. And Elias knew the moment he saw Urzoth's face go bloodless beneath its green, that this visitor was different from all the rest. He was old for an orc, silver threading his dark hair, a network of pale scars crossing one side of his face where an old wound had never healed clean, and he carried himself with the weary authority of a man who had spent his whole life enforcing decisions he did not always agree with. "Uncle," Urzoth said, and the word came out choked, half greeting and half warning. "Niece," Cagran said, and his gaze slid past her to Elias, standing in the cloister doorway with a hand near his sword hilt, and something like pity flickered across the old orc's ruined face. "So it is true, then, the rumors that reach the clan fires. My sister's daughter hiding in a human's keep like a stray cat taken in by a lonely widower." "I am not hiding," Urzoth said. "I am refusing." "You cannot refuse forever," Cagran said. Gorlak grows old and impatient, and his younger brother whispers of breaking the treaty and finishing what the last war started, if the marriage is not made by midwinter. Your defiance is not only your own to spend, Urzoth. It is bought with the blood of every clansman who will die if the peace fails. "I know the cost," Urzoth said, low and fierce. "I have carried it every day for 2 years. Do not lecture me on duty, uncle. I know it better than you." "Then come home," Cagran said, and for a moment something almost gentle crossed his scarred face. "Come home and let this human folly end before it costs you more than you know." He left that evening without pressing further, saying only that he would return before the moon turned, and that she should think carefully on what she owed her people before he did. He did not truly leave. Elias found this out 3 nights later, in the worst possible way. It was late, the fire in the bell tower burned low, and Urzoth had come to him at last, truly come to him, past the kisses stolen in doorways and the lingering touches over the anvil, past every careful boundary either of them had drawn. And in the soft dark of his own chamber, with the sea sighing far below the window, she had finally let him see all of her guarded heart laid bare, murmuring his name like something sacred against his throat. Both of them lost entirely to a tenderness 2 seasons in the making. Neither of them heard the door. Cagran's roar of outrage split the night like a thunderclap, and Elias came up off the bed already reaching for a blade that was not there, and Urzoth was on her feet a heartbeat later, pulling a sheet about herself, her face a mask of horror and fury both. "Uncle, you disgrace yourself." Cagran's voice shook with a fury Elias had not thought the old, weary man capable of. "You disgrace your mother's memory, your clan's honor, everything I have spent 2 years trying to protect for you with a human, in a human's bed, while the treaty hangs by a thread. It is not your business it is every clansman's business," Cagran roared. "If word of this reaches Gorlak before the treaty is signed, he will not merely reject you, Urzoth, he will call it insult, he will call it war, and every soul in our clan will pay for what you have done here tonight." He moved before either of them could stop him, faster than a man his age should have moved, and seized Elias by the arm with bruising strength, dragging him bodily from the bed. Kagrun, no. Urzoth's voice cracked with something Elias had never heard from her pure, unguarded terror. He comes with me, Kagrun snarled, hauling Elias toward the door despite his struggling. Until you agree to return and complete the marriage as promised, your human stays where you cannot reach him, and you will learn, niece, exactly what your defiance costs. He dragged Elias half-dressed, disoriented, furious down through the dark corridors of the old monastery, past the chapter house and the forge, down a narrow stair Elias had explored only once as a boy, into the old mine workings that honeycombed the cliff beneath Craghollow, tunnels the monks had carved a century past chasing seams of iron and silver before the vein ran dry, and the passages were abandoned to damp and dark. "You'll die of the cold before she gives in," Elias said, twisting against the old orc's grip, though the passage walls pressed close and unfamiliar around him, lit only by the guttering torch Kagrun had snatched from a wall bracket. "She will give in long before that," Kagrun said grimly, "because she loves you, fool, whether she has the courage to say the word or not, and I have seen what love does to good sense." They struggled at the mouth of a deeper gallery, Elias twisting free at last and shoving hard against the old orc's chest, and Kagrun stumbled back against one of the ancient timber props that held the low ceiling, a beam gone soft and gray with a century of damp. The crack it made was like a musket shot in the confined dark. Elias had only a heartbeat's warning, a shower of grit, a groan of settling stone before the world came down. He threw himself forward, away from the collapsing gallery behind him, and the roar of falling rock filled the tunnel entire, dust and debris choking the air. And when it finally settled into ringing silence, Elias found himself alone in a small stone pocket no larger than a chapel nave, sealed off from the stair, from the surface, from air that did not taste of old dust and older stone. Somewhere on the other side of the rubble, faint and frantic, he heard Urzoth screaming his name. She had run the moment she heard the stone give way, run barefoot and half-dressed through the dark halls of Craghollow with a terror unlike anything she had felt on any battlefield, and when she reached the mine stair and found it choked floor to ceiling with fallen rock, she did not weep, and she did not despair, though every instinct screamed at her to do both. Elias. She threw herself at the rubble, clawing stone away with bare hands, heedless of the tearing of her nails, the blood that welled beneath them within minutes. "Elias, answer me." His voice came back muffled, distant, alive. "I'm here. I'm all right, Urzoth. I'm a cough, thick with dust. The passage ahead of me is open, I think, but this way's blocked solid. How bad is it?" She pressed her ear to the rubble and heard, beneath his voice, the ominous creak of settling stone, the slow trickle of grit still sifting down from above. "Bad, very bad. A wrong move, a wrong stone pulled from the wrong place, and the whole gallery might come down on both their heads." Kagrun appeared at her shoulder, torch in hand, his scarred face gray with more than dust. "There is another way," he said hoarsely. "An older gallery, further down, it may connect. But it will take hours to reach on foot, through passages I have not walked, and I do not know if it holds a way through at all." "Hours he may not have," Urzoth said, and turned back to the rubble and began to dig. "Niece, this is madness. The whole ceiling could bring me a pick," she said, not looking at him, "or get out of my way." He brought her a pick. She dug for 6 hours without stopping. She did not think of Gorlak, or of the treaty, or of the 2 years of running that had brought her to this cliff and this man and this collapsed and airless dark. She thought only of the next stone, and the one after that, working with a pick where she could and her bare hands where the pick would only worsen the fall, feeling every muscle in her back and shoulders scream in protest, feeling the old arrow wound in her shoulder tear open fresh beneath the strain and bleed sluggishly down her arm, and still she did not stop. "Urzoth," Kagrun's voice, hours in, hoarse with worry he no longer bothered to hide. "You will kill yourself at this pace. Rest. Let me spell you." "You are not strong enough to hold this section alone," she said, not looking up from the stone in her hands. "One misplaced blow and it all comes down on him. I will not risk it." "Why?" Kagran demanded, and there was something almost desperate in the question, as if he needed to understand, needed some answer that made sense of the niece he thought he knew tearing her hands to ruin for a human smith. "Why do you dig like this, Urzoth? He is a stranger, a human, not even your own kind." She paused, chest heaving, blood and dust caking her hands to the wrist, and looked back at her uncle with eyes that burned in the guttering torchlight. "Because it is my duty," she said, and the word came out rough, half a lie even as she spoke it. "Because he stood between me and an arrow when he owed me nothing. Because he has fed me and sheltered me and never once asked what I could give him in return. I owe him this, Kagran. That is all, duty, nothing more." Kagran said nothing for a long moment, watching her dig with the desperate, relentless fury of a woman who had convinced herself of a lie in order to bear what the truth would cost her. "Duty does not tear its own hands bloody for a debt already paid," he said quietly. "Duty does not weep while it digs, niece." Urzoth froze, and only then realized that tears had been cutting clean tracks through the dust on her face for the better part of an hour, unnoticed, unacknowledged, and something in her chest cracked open at her uncle's words, some last wall giving way as surely as the stone beneath her hands. "Then call it what you will," she said, voice breaking. "I do not care what name it wears. I only know that if he dies behind this stone, something in me dies with him, and I have run from enough dying, uncle. I will not run from this." She put her hands back to the rubble, and this time Kagran knelt beside her without another word, and together, uncle and niece, they dug. Elias, on the other side of the fall, had found a way to make himself useful rather than simply wait to be rescued or to die. He had discovered, by touch in the dark, that the pocket he was sealed in connected to a narrow side gallery, and by working loose stones from his side, matching the rhythm of the pick strikes he could faintly hear through the rubble, he helped hollow a passage from both directions at once. A slow and terrifying negotiation with several tons of unstable stone that neither side could see the other working. "Urzoth," he called out, hours into the dark, his voice raw with dust and thirst. "Urzoth, can you hear me? I hear you." Her voice, closer now than it had been, thick with exhaustion. "Do not stop talking, Elias. I need to hear you are still there." So he talked about nothing, about everything, about the sea view from the bell tower and the first sword he had ever forged as a boy, and the way she looked in the morning light of the forge with sweat on her brow and iron in her hands, and she answered when she could spare the breath, and between them, word by word and stone by stone, the wall between them grew thin enough to see torchlight through. "I see light," Elias shouted, and threw himself at the last barrier of rubble, and Urzoth, on the other side, gave a cry that was half sob and drove the pick through the final seam of stone with a strength that should not have been possible for anyone, orc or human, after 6 hours of unbroken labor. The gap widened. A hand, green, bloodied, torn, ragged at the nails, thrust through the opening, and Elias seized it with both of his own and held on as if he would never let go again. "Elias." Her voice cracked entirely on his name. "I'm here," he said. "I'm here, Urzoth. You came for me." "Of course I came for you," she said, and there was no more pretense of duty in it, no more careful lie to hide behind. "Did you truly think I would not?" They widened the gap enough for him to squeeze through, scraped and dust-caked and shaking, and the moment he was clear of the rubble, Urzoth pulled him into her arms with a force that nearly cracked his ribs, burying her face against his shoulder, her whole massive frame trembling with the release of 6 hours' terror, finally allowed to break. "I thought," she said, muffled against him, "I thought I had lost you before I ever told you what you are to me." "Then tell me now," Elias said, cupping her bloody, dust-streaked face in both hands. "I love you," Urzoth said, the words rough and unpracticed and utterly without hesitation, as if 6 hours of digging through stone had scoured every last doubt from her along with the skin of her hands. "I love you, Elias Lawson, and I do not care what it costs me to say it." He kissed her then, dust and blood and all, and she kissed him back with a desperate, fierce tenderness that said more than any words could have. And behind them Cagran stood in the torchlight, silent, his scarred face unreadable, watching the niece he had come to drag home by duty choose instead to be found by love. They emerged from the mine an hour before dawn, all three of them filthy and exhausted, and Cagran sat with them in the cold cloister yard as the sky began to gray, his ceremonial spear laid across his knees, saying nothing for a long while. "I watched you dig for 6 hours," he said finally, "with your hands torn to the bone, and I will not stand here and pretend I saw duty in it. I saw a woman who loves a man enough to tear a mountain apart with her bare hands rather than lose him. I have enforced clan law for 30 years, Urzoth. I know duty's face well enough to know when I am looking at something else entire. Then what will you tell Gorlak?" Urzoth asked, wrapping Elias' hand in both of her ruined ones, unwilling even now to let him go. Cagran was silent a long moment, staring out at the brightening horizon where the sea met the sky in a line of soft gold. "I will tell him," he said slowly, "that the mine collapsed upon a fleeing fugitive, and that Urzoth Thunderroar died beneath the stone before I could bring her home. It is not so great a lie. Something in you did die tonight, niece, the woman who thought duty and love could never share a single heart. Let Gorlak believe the rest is buried with her." "He will not simply accept my death without proof," Urzoth said. "He will send others to be certain." "Then I will bring him proof enough to satisfy him," Cagran said, and there was the ghost of something almost warm in his ruined face now. "A length of your hair taken from the rubble. A token of grief for your clan to mourn properly, so the treaty may be renegotiated through other means. A tribute, perhaps, rather than a bride. I have heard, niece, that this smith of yours forges the finest steel in 3 provinces. Perhaps a blade fit for a chieftain would satisfy a man's pride as well as a bride would, if it were offered with the proper ceremony and enough gold to smooth his temper." Elias looked between them, understanding dawning slowly through his exhaustion. "You're saying I forge Gorlak a sword, and he calls the debt paid." "I am saying," Cagran said, "that a chieftain who receives a masterwork blade worthy of legend, delivered with all appropriate honor and enough tribute gold besides, may find his pride sufficiently soothed to accept a renegotiated peace that costs him no bride at all, provided the woman who once was promised to him is believed to be beyond reach of any further claim." He rose, gathering his spear, and looked down at his niece with something that might, in a better light, have been mistaken for affection. "I will need 3 months to arrange it properly. Do not leave this cliff before then, either of you, and do not be seen by any other hunter foolish enough to still be chasing a dead woman's bounty." He left before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, walking the cliff road alone back toward the east, and Urzoth watched him go until he was only a shape and then nothing at all against the pale morning, and only then did she let herself lean fully into Elias' side, all the fight finally draining out of her at once. "Do you think he means it?" Elias asked quietly. "About the lie. He is the most honorable man I have ever known," Urzoth said. "If he says it will be done, it will be done." She turned her ruined hands over in the growing light, wincing at the sight of them properly for the first time. "I believe I have earned some tending, Smith. These will need binding before they fester." "Then let's get you inside," Elias said, "before the whole world sees just how thoroughly you tunneled through solid rock for a man you claim was only ever a duty." She huffed something that was almost a laugh, exhausted and raw, and let him lead her back into the keep. And if her hand found his and held tight the entire way, neither of them remarked upon it, because by then there was no longer any need to pretend it was anything other than what it plainly was. The 3 months that followed were the strangest and gentlest of Elias' life. He forged the blade for Gorlak with more care than he had ever put into any commission, folding the steel not 7 times but 9, at Urzoth's insistence, quenching it in seawater drawn at the dark of the moon, as her people's old traditions demanded for a peace gift meant to carry real weight. Urzoth worked the forge beside him every day of it, her ruined hands healing slowly beneath careful bandaging. And in the evenings, when the work was done, they sat together in the bell tower and watched the sea change color with the dying light. And slowly, day by day, the careful walls both of them had built came all the way down. She told him, one such evening, of her mother, dead in the same war that had birthed the treaty binding her to Gorlak, and how she had spent 2 years running not merely from a marriage she despised, but from the fear that she owed her mother's memory a debt only obedience could pay. And now? Elias asked, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against him in a way that would have seemed impossible, absurd even, on the night he first found her bleeding in the gorse. Now I think my mother would rather see me happy on a cliff with a human smith than dutiful and miserable in Gorlak's hall, Urzoth said. I think duty without joy is only another kind of dying, slower than the mine but no less final. I do not intend to die that way, Elias. Not anymore. He kissed her temple, and she turned into him fully, and the kiss that followed carried none of the desperate hunger of the tunnel, none of the fierce urgency of stolen moments. Only a warmth, deep and unhurried, of two people who had finally stopped running from what they wanted. Word came from Kagran in the 9th week, carried by a trusted rider from the eastern passes. Gorlak had accepted the blade and the tribute gold, had declared himself satisfied, had even grudgingly, Kagran's letter noted with dry humor, admitted the sword was the finest piece of steel he had ever held, worth easily the price of 100 brides. The treaty stood renewed on new terms. No one hunted a dead woman. Urzoth Thunderroar, so far as the wider world was concerned, had perished in a mine collapse on some nameless cliff, and the peace her clan had bled for held steady in her absence. "You're free," Elias said, reading the letter over her shoulder, his hand at the small of her back. "Truly free, Urzoth. I have been free since the moment I chose to dig through that mountain rather than let you die on the other side of it," she said, turning in his arms to face him fully. This letter only makes it safe to say so aloud. That evening, as the sun sank into the sea in a blaze of gold and red that turned the whole cliff to fire, Urzoth led him out past the bell tower to the very edge of Craghallow's grounds, where the old monastery wall gave way to open grass, and the long drop to the rocks and water far below. "There is a custom among my people," she said, standing before him with the wind off the sea pulling loose strands of dark hair free of her braid, when a warrior chooses her own mate rather than accepting one chosen for her. It is called the claiming. It is not spoken lightly, and it is not undone once given. "Tell me," Elias said, though something in his chest had already gone tight and warm with anticipation. "It is this," Urzoth said, and stepped close, cupping his face in both her scarred, healing hands with a tenderness that belied their strength. "I choose you, Elias Lawson, not out of duty, not to pay any debt, real or imagined. I choose you because you stood between me and an arrow when you owed me nothing, because you never once asked me to be smaller or gentler or more like the women of your own kind, because you dug through your own fear as surely as I dug through that mountain, word by word, to reach me in the dark. I am done pretending this was ever anything but devotion. I love you and I claim you, before this sky and this sea, and whatever gods still watch over ruined old monasteries as mine." Her forehead pressed against his, and Elias, throat too tight for words, answered the only way he could. He kissed her, deep and sure and utterly without hesitation, his hands finding the curve of her waist beneath the worn leather she had worn since the very first night he found her bleeding in the gorse, and she made a low sound against his mouth that was equal parts want and relief, as if 2 years of running had finally, truly, come to rest. "I claim you too," he murmured against her lips, when they finally broke apart enough to breathe. "For whatever that's worth, coming from a human smith with no clan and no ceremony to offer." "It is worth everything," Urzoth said fiercely, "because it is freely given, and I have learned this year that freely given is worth more than every bride price in every clan hall from here to the Ashfall Mountains." The sun sank fully into the sea, and the first stars came out cold and bright above the cliff. And there, at the edge of the world, with the old broken bell tower behind them and the long fall to the rocks below, and nothing else in all the wide dark evening but the two of them, Urzoth Thunderroar pulled Elias Lawson down into the soft grass, and let the world fall entirely away, the sound of the surf far below rising to meet the low sound of her laughter, warm and unguarded and entirely his. As the sky wheeled slow and silver overhead, and neither of them thought once more of duty, because at last between them there was only love, freely chosen and freely kept. They stayed at Craghollow through the winter that followed, and the keep that had once echoed only with Elias' lonely footsteps rang instead with the sound of two hammers on two anvils, orc-fold steel and human steel meeting in the middle to make something neither tradition could have forged alone. No hunters came again. The world believed Urzoth Thunderroar long dead upon a nameless cliff, and in the particular freedom of being thought a ghost, she lived more fully than she ever had beneath her own name. Cagran visited twice more over the following year, always briefly, always bearing news of a peace that held, of a chieftain grown fat and satisfied with his masterwork blade and his tribute gold, of a clan that no longer whispered war. Each time he came, he looked a little less like a man enforcing duty, and a little more like an uncle glad simply to see his niece well. And each time he left without ever quite admitting how much the sight of her happiness had come to matter to him. And each evening, when the forge fires banked low, and the sea turned the color of old iron beneath a darkening sky, Urzoth Thunderroar would climb the broken bell tower stair to find Elias Lawson waiting, and would fold herself into his arms as though she had been carved for exactly that shape, and would tell him without fail, in a voice that no longer needed to hide behind duty or debt or any other name but the true one, that she loved him, and that she was glad, endlessly and fiercely glad, that she had never once stopped digging until she reached him.